A simple series of questions to consider. By the model of evolution, why did humans become meat eaters since all apes are herbivores, even though they have distinct prominent canines? Maybe a certain group for primitive humans migrated to colder climate where vegetation was severely lacking. Then were they so stupid to migrate to a place that has no vegetation? Or, maybe they found themselves in a sudden change of climate that severely reduced the amount of vegetation in their area. Again, were they so stupid to not move and find a place with more vegetation? After or during the evolutionary millions of years for the ape species, if any of them became meat eaters, it is very likely that they ate the meat raw, as is the case of all carnivorous animals. Maybe the so-called Ice Age made it impossible to find vegetation elsewhere. Then those primitive humans needed to invent a way to make fire to keep warm first, before they started to kill animals for meat. If those species of apes had no hairy thick hide, they would quickly need a way to make fire. But, if they can't find enough vegetation, how can they build a fire? Otherwise, if they first killed certain animals for their furry skin and fat, they still ate the meat raw. So then, even if by whatever chance primitive humans discovered how to make fire, what would compel them to cook their food, if they were accustomed to eat their food raw like the other animals? I need to add, there is no missing link of ape species to human species. There is only missing proof and cause for the robust and environmentally suitable apes to mutate and de-evolve into a thin-skinned, physically weaker species who become an environmental cancer to the whole Earth. All those fossil skulls of ape men are just ape skulls on human bodies. Even if by some accident they burnt the meat, most meats without seasoning like salt, still tastes just as bad as raw meat, unless they knew specifically to cook the fatty meat of certain particular animals that has plenty of fat. Also, why would they hunt to kill any animal when they have no natural ability to do so in the same manner as carnivorous animals do with their teeth and claws? Obviously they would have to utilize and develop tools to hunt and kill an animal. Very likely they initially would eat animals that had already died by other causes, as scavengers rather than as hunters. Or maybe they hunted defenseless creatures like shellfish and snails. In that case they would supply the majority of their diet to forage and gather vegetation primarily. If a species of apes developed the ability to domesticate and control the cultivation of specific vegetation and process them with fire for food, clothing and hardware, could they have applied these same techniques to certain animals simultaneously? If so, this seems more to conform to the model of creation where humans were created to be herbivores. The implication with the creation model is even more significant. In this model, all conditions were ideally suited for humans to be foragers and gatherers for their food. The climate also was very stable globally and warm, or temperate. So, under what circumstances were humans inspired if not compelled to create fire? There would not have been any lightning storms in the garden or in Eden in general that would strike a tree, cause a bushfire, or forest fire, and no lava flows that burn everything in its path. Or maybe that only the garden was protected to be ideal, the rest of Eden and the world was still a hostile, untamed wilderness. So, after they were expelled from the garden, they would have plenty of chances to witness such events. However, there is one problem to that. Adam and Eve witnessed the awesome nature of fire for the first time when the angels with spinning blades of fire prevented them re-entering the garden. That was obviously a divine inspiration to them. After this event, if by whatever means humans discovered how to make fire, it most likely had to be a divine sacred event for them, and devoted to it as a sacred ritual. This idea gives credence to the origin of offering burnt sacrifices to gods, as practiced by most of the ancient cultures of the world, if not all of them. However, as herbivores, by what precedence would humans be compelled to kill animals, and burn them, especially those with fatty meat, as suggested by the book of Genesis chapter 4 verse 4? Humans must have had learned the process of life and death from the short mortal lifespans of animals and as they witness in the natural wilderness of predators eating prey. However, all animals were likewise supposed to be herbivores according to the creation account of Genesis chapter 1. According to chapter 9 though, that may exclude creatures not considered as souls with no red blood, like insects and crustaceans. This is credible from the fact predator animals do eat insects and plant-based foods made by humans, especially sweet cakes for example. They may have developed a taste for red-blooded meat after the Great Flood, since there were likely a great lack of suitable vegetation for these animals to eat. Although the life of an animal cannot compensate for the life of a human, whether primitive humans understand that or not is not relevant, except that it is a fair offer to a god rather than just vegetation, since God made humans to be lord of all animals. However, this was a long time before the Bible says God had allowed humans to eat meat as food in Genesis chapter 9 verse 3, which is just after the Great Flood event. Likewise, this corresponds to the Chinese legend of Swiren, fire maker, Sheneng, divine husbandman, and Boxi, animal domesticator. As their name suggests, they taught people to domesticate plants and animals and to cook their food long before the time of the Chinese version of the Great Flood event of Emperor Yao, which corresponds approximately the same time as the biblical event. In this regard, Boxi seems to correspond to Abel and Sheneng as Cain. They provide details of the whole event of social development to the Cain and Abel story in regards to Chinese legends. This legend suggests that people had learned not only to eat meat but to cook it. The problem with the Chinese legends in regards to food is that in either case of the evolutionary model or the creation model, I see no justification to believe that people were sick from eating vegetables raw, especially as a reason to add meat to their diet. First of all, raw meat would make them sicker than eating raw vegetables. Therefore, whenever they learned to cook the meats, they must have cooked their vegetables likewise to avoid getting sick. The only necessity for meat would be a lack of vegetation, as in a drought. This is possible living in the hostile wilderness outside of Eden in a post-flood scenario. They may have felt justified to kill animals by observing predatory animals eating prey. The Chinese legends don't provide a credible reason for eating meat. Now, with the usual bounteous overproduction by nature that God has given us with wild vegetation, if it is not consumed all at one time, much of it seems to go to waste as they rot, decay into the ground. But what is most notable about this process of decay is the fermentation. With cultivation and experimentation, this decaying process of fermentation will give us vinegar and beer. Wild grains, like rice, wheat, barley, sorghum, and wild legumes like soybean are too small to have been considered as a source of food until as they likewise decay and ferment into something aromatic, unlike most weeds. So, fermentation is likely one of the earliest methods of processing vegetation to obtain a greater variety of food, with vinegar and beer as the earliest inventions of civilization. I am sure nobody got sick of consuming beer, unless they drink too much of it, possibly being a popular method of curing and preservation of food. This likewise may have been a popular form of food sacrifice from vegetation in the manner of libations, which is a practice that is still performed even in the present time. Would God reject libations of beer or wine, if Cain offered it? Otherwise, the use of salt with food would only be popular in areas with natural salt deposits, although, sea water could directly be responsible to inspire humans to use salt in their food. And the inspiration to make sugar or molasses with the use of fire, would only occur long after the use of honey and maple sap, as they would have observed it being consumed by certain animals that forage for it specifically. Sun drying of food for curing and preservation would most likely be the most popular method, especially in areas with long dry hot seasons. This climatic condition would likewise lead humans to grind their dried foods into flour to make bread or meal. This would initially coincide with the process of sun-baked mud bricks for building homes even before the use of fire. So then, if animals were hunted and or domesticated primarily for sacrifice, the extra benefit would be their hide for clothing. Maybe then God really did kill, sacrifice, an animal to provide Adam and Eve animal skins for clothing. Although, I still believe God gave us pubic and body hair as if they were animals' skins. If so, it is not likely the animal was already dead, being naturally mortal, as God took the hides to clothe Adam and Eve. This is certain because God later prohibits touching a dead animal from natural causes or accidents as unclean and unholy. For this reason, Some religions consider this as the first sacrifice in behalf of humans for their sins. Maybe in this way Adam and Eve were taught to sacrifice animals for their sins. Thus, the process of using animal skins for clothing continued, but it may have been limited as a sacred event only for the privileged patriarchs. The carcass of the animal being processed for a burnt sacrifice would have the skin removed, then burn the flesh and gizzards and bones into ashes, until each part obtained more religious significance. Bones would be used for charms, and gizzards for divination and medicines or potions. The less privileged would only benefit from the textile of sheared wool of domesticated or docile wild animals, thus preserving the life of the animal. It would seem then that wearing leather was as sacred as the use of fire itself. If hunting animals by early man were a normal event simply to provide food, it does not seem worthy a theme to devote to a rock painting, whereas if the hunt itself were part of a sacred ritual for an animal sacrifice as a more worthy theme. In this case, humans could only have been compelled to eat meat, if by impiety the patriarchs as priests, were inspired to imitate the fallen angels as gods on earth, to refrain from fully burning the meat and to eat it instead with the fatty parts. This is suggested by legendary information of the gods, demigods, heroes, and giants of the fallen angels, eating the flocks and herds of farmers, and of cannibalism from human sacrifices. It seems like a bad choice of words to say that the burning of animal fatty meat was a pleasant aroma to God, as stated in Genesis chapter 8 verse 21. Was this pleasing aroma actually a human sentiment, compelling humans to likewise to eat the meat instead of burning it completely to ashes? Unless it was assumed by Moses that since the burning of fat was a pleasant aroma to man, then likewise it was a pleasant aroma to God. However, as something sacred, it is only after the impiety of the fallen angels as gods on earth did humans follow suit. Maybe that expression actually means a satisfying compensation. Eating meat, the flesh of animals, is detrimental to our longevity. It shortens our lifespan. The biblical patriarchs from Adam to Noah and the entire human race at that time had a much greater lifespan of nearly 1,000 years. Most people assume that changed, reduced to an extremely shorter lifespan because of the climate change after the great flood of Noah's day. However, that did not affect Noah and his sons, as they also lived a very long lifespan, including the Yellow Emperor, who according to Chinese legend lived to be 300 years old. Also, it was not a command by God to limit our lifespan to 120 years, as it says in Genesis chapter 6 verse 3. God was indicating the amount of time remaining before the world is destroyed by flood. Besides, 120 years is still longer than the lifespan most people live now. The change to our lifespan happened as stated in Genesis chapter 9 verse 3 to 6. God allowed man to eat all animal flesh as food. He did not even make a restriction of eating pork or any other unclean animal. In that allowance a balance is decreed in verse 5, to paraphrase, that our lifeblood or lifespan will be reduced for the lifespan of the lifeblood of the animal we eat. In other words, we eat ourselves into a shorter lifespan and we are judged for a human's lifeblood. In regards to the law at that time, before the era of Christ's ransom sacrifice, it was a life for a life. So, if we were to kill another human, then we forfeit our own life. However, with animals, if we kill and eat an animal, only part of our own lifespan is reduced. Therefore, God can say our sins are forgiven partially as we die partially by a reduction of our lifespan. In a technical point of view, when we eat animal flesh, our body has to decompose the animal flesh and then rebuild it into human flesh. Otherwise, when we eat vegetation, our body decomposes plant tissue easily to build human flesh. There is a lot more energy lost in us in the process of decomposing flesh to build flesh than to decompose plant tissue to build flesh. We save a lot more energy from eating plants to be used in more vital areas of our body. Also, animals are created to be mortal, to die, but plants normally do not die, nor do their seeds, unless something in the environment kills them, contrary to what the Bible says in John 12:24 and 1 Corinthians 15:36. Plants are not immortal, but they strive towards immortality. They are programmed, created to always grow and spread. It is better to eat food that lives than to eat food that dies. Otherwise, again, it is obvious to suspect that before the flood there were a lot more vegetation that could satisfy our nutritional needs and our appetites in a similar manner as animal meat. So, after the flood, God would let us eat meat to meet that satisfaction. Then again, in my opinion, since God knows we are going to die anyway, it does not matter to him if we live 700 years as herbivores or 100 years as omnivores, we are going to die anyway. So go ahead, enjoy eating meat. However, that being said, in the current era of Christ's ransom sacrifice, people normally curse themselves to a short lifespan because they believe that it is natural to die. But Christ by his sacrifice gives us the opportunity to live forever physically as humans. John chapter 17 verse 3, this means everlasting life, their coming to know you, the only true God, and the one whom you sent, Jesus Christ. John chapter 6 verse 50-51, this is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that anyone may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread he will live forever. John chapter 11 verse 26, and everyone who is living and exercises faith in me will never die at all. Do you believe this? John chapter 21 verse 22-23, Jesus said to him, if it is my will for him to remain until I come, of what concern is that to you? You continue following me. So the saying went out among the brothers that this disciple would not die. Matthew chapter 16 verse 28, truly I say to you that there are some of those standing here who will not taste death at all until first they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Matthew chapter 24 verse 34, truly I say to you that this generation will by no means pass away until all these things happen. The implication of these scriptures is that many of his disciples and apostles may still be alive, walking this earth in the wilderness, as the woman in Revelation chapter 12. This is profoundly significant. This means we have immortals among us who are eyewitnesses of the Messiah. I would add, there is no actual proof that those disciples and apostles had died. It is very likely they had died. There would be some kind of monument marking where they died, since they are the very pillars and foundation of the Christian faith. Also, as a disclaimer, by being a strict vegetarian or vegan is not going to increase our lifespan in itself. That ship has already sailed. Personally, as I have previously been eating meat, and my parents, grandparents, and ancestors all have been eating meat, our lifespan cannot get any shorter. By the time our bodies reach maturity we start to die already. We cannot undo thousands of years of biological damage, and currently practically everything in our environment is killing us. We can only take comfort of feeling healthier as vegetarians and respecting our bodies as God's temple, 1 Corinthians 16:19. The eating of meat has hindered one natural development in my opinion. There is an extensive diversity of a no-flesh meat food science that can itself make eating meats unnecessary and unwanted. For example, fruits are not simply something sweet to eat raw or cooked as cakes and candy. Fruits have the potential of being the very substitute of meats, or rather a superior replacement. Fruits can be cooked with salt and spices in various ways to greatly increase the variety of flavors of a meal. It is precisely by cooking it ripe, not just unripe, with salt and spices that it offers a flavor competitive to that of any meat. It is a bit too exhaustive to list all the fruits we have available to us, so I will just use an example from what I discovered. Durian is an exotic and locally popular tropical fruit, but it really smells bad. The taste is sweet, but I think the bad smell make it seem to taste bad as well. People have consumed this fruit for a long time, maybe 1,000 years, and even made candies from it, but it still smells bad. Now one time I was desperate to have something to fry with my rice. I had previously decided not to eat meats anymore, including fish. It so happened that durian was in season and there was plenty available, even overripe. Certain members of the household had some durian that was overripe and offered some to me. I initially refused, but then I changed my mind because I had a notion to cook the durian with the rice. I figured cooking the durian might kill the bad smell. Basically, I knew cooking is a way to transform foods to become more edible. It seemed a bit messy while cooking it, but it worked. It still had a unique smell but more pleasant and aromatic. It also had a very addictive taste to it, like eggs and bacon. Then I had the idea to cook the durian with pancit, a Philippine noodle, to make soup with the usual spices of salt and chili pepper. It also tasted fantastic. It is too bad durian is a seasonal fruit unlike coconut, because I became addicted to both recipes I created. So now I am thinking, what other fruits can I cook this way? The funny thing about this is that for 1,000 years, more or less, people have been eating durian fresh and stinky, but never had anyone thought to cook it, to get the bad smell out. I had even cooked it with calamansi juice and sugar, and it did not smell or even taste anything like durian, but rather it tasted overwhelmingly like a calamansi sauce. Strange enough, many people already know to cook some fruits with salt, though usually as raw fruits like jackfruit, nunca, and papaya. I guess it normally must seem undesirable to cook sweet ripe fruits with salt and spices, but that is practical as well. Food science has some basic ways to process food. 1. Biological, fermentation, mold, fungi. 2. Chemical, alcohol, vinegar, salt, sugar, oil. 3. Mechanical, sun drying, grinding, and milling. 4. Fire, cooking, frying, baking, roasting, smoking, etc., etc. This means that any one food item of fruits can be processed in any way of these various methods and in combination of methods. So why should fruits should only be eaten as fresh and cooked only in the traditional ways as cakes and candies? The creation model therefore provides the only plausible explanation for the historical choices humans made for our staple foods and how we process them.